Today on Ethical Discussions, we will be looking at the use of experimental drugs to treat Ebola. In this episode, we will be delving deep into the ethical dilemma of administering experimental drugs and hearing two perspectives on the issue by talking to a medical doctor and an FDA official. Ebola is an aggressive virus mostly prevalent in Western Africa. Ebola is transmitted through contact with an affected symptomatic individual, typically through direct contact of mucous membranes, like through the eyes or abrasions on the skin. The virus begins by attacking dendritic cells, which are the brain of the immune system. Normally, dendritic cells signal to other types of cells to attack the invader. The virus then uses the host cell to produce more viruses and signal death to other cells of the immune system. The viruses propagating through the body cause coagulation in blood vessels, organ failure, and internal bleeding. With a lack of blood in the body, the cells do not obtain enough oxygen and begin to die. A final immune response can damage the virus, but also causes damage to the body, further progressing the severity of the disease. Ebola has an average fatality rate of 50%. In 2014, there was the largest outbreak of Ebola in West Africa to date. Major global news outlets like the New York Times and BBC ran headlines like
West Africa on Ebola virus, high alert.
And
Ebola, killing scores in Guinea, threatens nearby nations.
Approximately 11,315 people died in 6 different countries: Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Mali, and the US. During this epidemic, many agencies and individuals across the world acted desperately to provide relief to the impacted countries to stop the spread of this deadly virus. Driven by the desperation to provide a cure and save lives, experimental drugs and techniques were administered to several patients. These actions prompted an incredible and wide-ranging debate on the ethics of experimental medicine. Dr. Tom Frieden, the director of the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, said, "I have never seen anything like this in my life." And coming from the head of the CDC, this was an extremely powerful statement.
Now we're going to talk to Dr. Colin Silverroot and ask him some questions to prompt a discussion about the Ebola crisis from the point of view of a physician. So our first question today is, what do you think your responsibilities and roles are during an epidemic?
Well, ideally, as a doctor, I would like to enter the situation and cure everyone. Clearly, that's fantasy. In reality, my job on the ground is to stop the bleeding, so to speak. By that I mean stop the spread of the contagion while attempting to treat those infected.
As you said, you would like to cure people. So are you also looking for alternatives that may offer a better chance of survival?
That's a tricky question. Up until now, the medical community was very concerned with being seen as taking advantage of a sensitive population by using them to test new drugs. This has happened in every major country over the last century, and the perception already exists that Africa has been abused by pharmaceutical companies. Accusations, have already been made that some companies would administer AIDS treatment only under the condition that the patient would also agree to a regimen of experimental drugs. However, what if you have a drug that shows promise and you can't or won't use it? What if you only use it on a certain population? In the modern world, there's really no right answer. If an experimental treatment works, you should have shared it. If it didn't, and say you hurt people, you would have been accused of exploiting sensitive populations. There's a specific case in the treatment of Ebola where a drug called ZMapp was administered to Americans. They lived. So as a result, there were numerous cases all over Liberia and other parts of Africa where patients were dying and their families asked and demanded the therapy and wondered why it appeared that only Americans could get it. Even the Liberian health minister said that the perception that Americans had a cure and were hiding it made his job substantially more difficult. As my colleague recently said, the shoe is on the other foot now. It's not that we would inflict horrible things on patients, but that we failed to inflict good things on them.
So what about the prospect, as you referenced earlier, of hurting people with experimental drugs?
Well, exactly. Under the same Ebola epidemic, an Italian NGO called Emergency started using an untested drug called amiodarone. In their clinics, higher death rates were reported as compared to other clinics. Where patients received amiodarone, 67% died, while the death rates at other clinics, run by basically Doctors Without Frontiers, were between 50 and 60%. This led 12 UK-based doctors who were employed by Emergency to leave the NGO in protest. The team that left even said, and I quote, "Our immediate concerns were surrounding the use of amiodarone on this vulnerable and difficult group of patients with complex physiology, and the concern that the toxic side effects of the drug could in fact be contributing to increased morbidity within the community. Given that the mortality rate in the LACA ETC is around 67%, despite aggressive intervention, and that there seemed to be a high rate of otherwise unexplained respiratory diseases, which in laboratory tests were linked to the drug in question, it appeared that there may be an aspect of this intensive therapy which had a detrimental effect."
So for our last question, do you see a right answer? And when I mean right answer, I'm talking about ethically speaking.
Well, after working on the ground, I have a much more profound respect for the seriousness of this illness in some patients. Even when you have optimum facilities for replenishment of fluids, things like that, the disease itself is truly devastating. That is something that might be missing from the perspective of regulatory agencies, a view on the ground. It is easy to say no to trying a drug when your only experience is the sterile numbers on a screen. At the same time, those numbers give you the perspective of the questions that I raised earlier. What are you doing? Are you going to be seen as helping people? Are you going to be seen as hurting people? Are you going to be seen as keeping something from people who need it? So is there a correct choice to test a drug or not? As a doctor, we're trained to do no harm, but when people are dying all around you begging for help, what is the right choice? I don't know. You tell me.
We just heard from Dr. Colin Sillerud on his perspectives towards experimental medicine and the Ebola outbreak. Next, we will hear from James Scacco, a representative of the FDA. He represents a different group of stakeholders and holds a different perspective on the experimental medicine. In the upcoming section, pay close attention to the moral code that the representative of the FDA abide by, and think about how the ethics of the FDA may be similar to or different from the code that a doctor may abide by.
So today we're going to be talking to James Scacco, an FDA administrator. We're going to be asking him some questions to kind of have a discussion about the ethics of Ebola from the agency's point of view. So to start off, what do you think your responsibilities and roles are during an epidemic?
Well, the role of the FDA always is to provide protections to people against untested drugs and treatments. we have pharmaceutical companies who are trying to make a profit and they're concerned with their bottom line. So it's our role as an administration to continue to provide protections to those people from these dangers.
So how do you feel about the ethical dilemmas surrounding the use of experimental drugs on patients dying from Ebola?
I think it's very important to ask ourselves the question, are we trying to learn about the treatments for future cases, or are we just trying to provide a better chance of survival for current patients? The main ethical question from our point of view is, what are the rights of the patient? And patient in this case is not always easy to define. We're talking about people currently suffering from the disease, but we're also talking about future patients who may contract the disease, and we want to know what is their recourse. If we administer an untested or unapproved drug to a patient, and that patient survives, we can definitely count that as a win. No question. However, without rigorous and controlled clinical trials, we can't confirm with any real certainty the efficacy of that drug.
Okay, is there any case in which the chance of success for a certain treatment would outweigh the risk?
Again, if we don't know for sure whether or not a treatment is effective, then it's our policy to treat it as ineffective. And the reason for this is, when ineffective, poor quality, or harmful medicines are administered, it can result in therapeutic failure, exacerbation of the disease, resistance to medicines, and sometimes death. It also undermines public confidence in health systems, health professionals, pharmaceutical manufacturers. So it's our job to make sure that we, as a society, don't cross that line. So following this most recent Ebola outbreak, there were 2 patients treated with ZMapp, which is still considered experimental. And this was done through expanded access rules under which unapproved medicines can be used on a compassionate use basis. And so, as nice as that may sound, in this case, the antibodies produced for the ZMapp weren't produced using good manufacturing practices. And so they may not meet quality standards for medical products. Are we really willing to take the risk that the antibodies will do more harm than good to the patient?
Also, what do you think the correct action moving forward would be with conducting clinical trials?
This is a challenging question, and in this case especially. Usually trials are coordinated in areas where there are plenty of resources and it's easy to recruit patients. Unfortunately, it is not desirable to conduct a clinical trial in only one region where the disease is prevalent, because we can't assume that everywhere else is the control group. There will no doubt be protests from people in other regions who are facing the same terrible disease if they're not receiving the same treatment. So it's important to perform these clinical trials in the conditions that most of the patients will be facing. Conducting a clinical trial in the US, for example, where resources are virtually limitless, is not representative of the end use for a successful treatment. This epidemic, with so many lives lost already, is heartbreaking and tragic. And the FDA is fully dedicated to doing all we can to help end it as quickly as possible. We're working interactively with companies to clarify regulatory requirements, to help expand manufacturing capacity, and we expedite the review of data as it is received, so there's no lag between receiving data and reviewing data. In situations like this, the FDA plays a very critical role. We have one of the most flexible regulatory frameworks in the world, and we are working diligently to facilitate and speed the development, manufacturing, and availability of investigational products such as vaccines, therapies, and diagnostic tests.
That sounds very good. Thank you so much for your time and for giving us some of your information as well as views on this.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Today on Ethical Discussions, we heard 2 different views on the ethical concerns of administering experimental drugs. It's important to understand that it is never a clear line, as is always the case with morals and ethics. What would you do in a situation with such an extraordinary epidemic and high mortality rate? How would you feel if your loved one had Ebola? If you were the doctor watching a patient die a slow and excruciating death, and you thought you had a cure, would you do what you could to administer the cure even if it wasn't proven by the FDA? With the whole world watching, would you be willing to approve administration of experimental drugs with the possibility of adverse consequences? Does the level of pain and suffering actually impact the ethical decision? In other words, is there a difference if one person is dying of a deadly disease or thousands are? Is the decision of what is right or wrong based upon the severity of the situation, or is it based upon ethical principles? Think about these questions and meditate on your own moral code. What would you do if you were on the front lines of decision making in such a catastrophic epidemic?